The alarms didn't start quietly, they screamed. In boardrooms, locker rooms, group chats, and league offices. The same word kept surfacing, in hushed, panicked tones. Doomed, not because of a bad season, not because of injuries, but because a single proposal detonated like a grenade inside the WNBA's fragile foundation. The players' union didn't just ask for more, they demanded a structure so aggressive, so reckless, that owners, executives, and insiders froze in disbelief. And once the numbers leaked, there was no unseeing them. This wasn't negotiation theater. This was an existential threat wrapped in legal language and sold as fairness. A revenue split that ignored expenses. A salary structure that assumed infinite growth. A plan that treated expansion fees like free money instead of lifelines. As the details spread, the league's brightest stars felt like hostages in a war they didn't start. Caitlin Clark's name surfaced immediately. So did Angel Reese, Paige Buchanan, Aliyah Boston. Faces of a league finally gaining momentum. Now caught between loyalty to teammates and the terrifying possibility that this deal could burn everything down. Owners whispered about losses that could erase decades. Executives talked about lockouts like inevitabilities. Social media exploded into chaos. Players posted defiance. Analysts screamed collapse. Fans split into warring camps, accusing greed on one side and exploitation on the other. A chilling truth hovered. If this proposal goes through, the WNBA as we know it might not survive. Because once money turns into ideology, someone always blinks right now, today. This crisis didn't appear out of nowhere. It was years in the making, buried under applause, growth headlines, and carefully curated optimism. The WNBA has always lived in a delicate contradiction, a league fueled by passion, activism, and elite talent, yet financially fragile, dependent on patience, subsidies, and belief more than profit. For decades, owners absorbed losses quietly while players fought for respect loudly. That uneasy balance held everything together, until now. As the league slowly expanded, so did expectations. Media deals improved, attendance surged in pockets. Stars like Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, Paige Buchanan, Aliyah Boston, and Kelsey Mitchell became more than players, they became symbols of a long-promised breakthrough. The narrative shifted from survival to success. And with that shift came something dangerous. Entitlement on one side, and anxiety on the other. Players remembered the years of underpayment, cramped flights, and empty arenas. Owners remembered the balance sheets, the red ink, the risk they kept shouldering while waiting for a moment that might never come. Both sides told themselves they were right. Both sides believed time was finally on their side. And that belief hardened into positions instead of compromise. Behind closed doors, union leadership began framing the moment as historic, not incremental, transformational. They argued the league's growth meant the old rules no longer applied, that players deserved a slice of gross revenue, not leftovers after expenses, that expansion fees were real money and should count, that patience had already been paid in full. The language wasn't cooperative, it was confrontational, and it spread fast. Owners, many of them NBA-backed, saw something else entirely. They saw a proposal detached from reality, a model that assumed infinite expansion, infinite growth, infinite tolerance for losses. They warned privately that this wasn't about fairness anymore, it was about viability, that paying players before the business stabilized could collapse the entire structure, that goodwill had limits. The league office tried to calm the waters. Kathy Engelbert spoke carefully about sustainability and opportunity. But even her words sounded thinner as the numbers circulated. Executives understood the optics. Locking out players in a moment of cultural momentum would be catastrophic, but so would agreeing to a deal that guaranteed massive losses. It was a no-win scenario forming in slow motion. Players felt cornered too. Union reps painted any compromise as betrayal. Social pressure mounted. Group chats filled with rage and resolve. No one wanted to be the one who blinked and got labeled weak. Especially not with a generation of stars watching, learning what power looked like in real time. Fans, meanwhile, were fed a simplified story. Greedy owners versus exploited athletes, but the truth was uglier. This wasn't about villains, it was about two sides sprinting toward a cliff. Convinced the other would stop first, and as the January deadline loomed closer, something shifted. The rhetoric hardened, leaks increased, words like lockout and collapse stopped being hypotheticals and started sounding like plans. Because once belief turns into ultimatum, the past stops mattering, and the next move was about to turn a labor dispute into a full-blown crisis no one could contain. The main conflict finally spilled into the open the moment the leaked numbers hit the public stream. What had been whispered behind closed doors was now blasted across timelines, podcasts, and television panels with a single, chilling phrase attached to it: catastrophic losses. The league's internal projections didn't just suggest pain, they predicted devastation. Hundreds of millions in red ink, losses eclipsing nearly 3 decades of combined struggle. And suddenly, the players' proposal wasn't framed as ambitious, it was framed as suicidal. Owners panicked. Not performative panic, real panic. Emergency calls were scheduled. Lawyers reread clauses they hoped they'd never need. NBA executives, already sensitive to subsidizing a league, still trying to find stable ground, began asking the quiet question no one wanted attached to their name: what if we walk away? Because once the numbers were out, the illusion of unlimited patience shattered. Players felt blindsided by the reaction. From their side, this was justice delayed, finally coming due. They saw packed arenas, viral clips, rising stars, and media rights, optimism. They saw Caitlin Clark selling out buildings, Angel Reese dominating headlines, Paige Buchers returning as a ratings magnet. To them, the league was finally cashing in and they wanted their share. Anything less felt like exploitation disguised as caution. That collision of realities ignited the first shocking twist. A high-level source leaked that several owners had already discussed a lockout timeline, internally not as leverage, but as contingency, not if, but when. The revelation hit like a sledgehammer. This wasn't brinkmanship anymore. This was preparation. And once that leak spread, the temperature across the entire ecosystem spiked instantly. Players erupted, group chats lit up with fury, union leaders doubled down publicly, accusing ownership of fear-mongering and bad faith. Social media became a battlefield. Some players posted cryptic messages about knowing their worth. Others hinted they'd sit out if forced. Fans were dragged into the chaos, choosing sides with incomplete information and full conviction. The league office scrambled to regain control. Kathy Engelbert's statements grew more urgent, emphasizing growth, sustainability, and partnership. But behind the scenes, the trust was cracking, because the shocking twist wasn't just the lockout talk. It was who started distancing themselves first. Sponsors began asking questions. Media partners quietly requested assurances. Expansion groups hesitated. And most alarming of all, a few star players' camps started exploring contingency plans. Overseas leagues, new ventures, unrivaled whispers. The idea that the WNBA could be paused even temporarily was no longer unthinkable. Then came the second blow within the same conflict. A union source disputed the loss projections entirely, calling them absolutely false. That single rebuttal split the narrative in half. Two realities, two math problems, two truths that couldn't coexist, and with no neutral arbiter trusted by both sides. The dispute turned ideological. Owners framed themselves as guardians of survival. Players framed themselves as creators of value. Each side accused the other of greed while denying it in themselves. The rhetoric escalated. Language hardened. Compromise became betrayal. And the clock kept ticking. Inside locker rooms, tension crept in. Veterans worried about lost seasons. Rookies feared stalled careers. Stars felt trapped between leadership roles and personal brands. Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, and others were suddenly asked questions they shouldn't have to answer yet about responsibility, sacrifice, and whether they'd side with teammates even if it meant torching the league's future. And that's when the conflict crossed a dangerous threshold. Because once players and owners stop arguing over numbers and start arguing over reality itself, negotiation stops being possible. It becomes a test of will, of who can endure the fallout longer, of who blinks first when the damage becomes irreversible. The first shocking twist wasn't just the lockout whispers, it was the realization that the WNBA wasn't negotiating anymore. It was bracing for impact. Negotiating anymore. It was bracing for impact. And the next phase wouldn't be about talks, it would be about escalation that could permanently alter the league's trajectory, no matter who won. The escalation didn't arrive as a headline, it arrived as behavior. Quiet shifts that told a louder truth than any press release ever could. Meetings shortened, tone hardened, smiles disappeared, and suddenly, both sides stopped pretending this was about compromise. It became about leverage and who was willing to risk total destruction to prove a point. the owners made the first visible move, not publicly, but strategically. Sources began leaking that certain franchises were already modeling a future without a season. Budgets were frozen, hiring slowed, marketing plans were quietly paused. Expansion timelines that once felt inevitable were suddenly described as flexible. That word alone sent shockwaves. Flexible meant optional, optional meant expendable. The players felt it immediately. Union leaders went into overdrive, flooding members with updates that sounded less like negotiations and more like war briefings. Phrases like "hold the line" and "historic moment" replaced ongoing talks. The pressure to stay unified intensified. Anyone questioning the proposal internally was framed as undermining progress. Silence became suspect. Doubt became disloyalty. And then came the second major twist. The one that split the players themselves. A confidential report began circulating among agents, suggesting that the proposed revenue model would disproportionately benefit a small group of top earners, while putting the league's long-term stability at risk. It wasn't public, it wasn't official, but it was devastating, because it introduced a fracture the union couldn't afford: internal doubt. Veterans nearing the end of their careers wanted guarantees now. Younger players wanted sustainability. Stars wanted leverage. Fringe players feared being collateral damage. That fracture widened when whispers spread that some high-profile names were quietly asking a different question altogether. What happens if the league pauses? Not rhetorically, practically. Overseas contracts. New domestic ventures. The unrivaled league suddenly felt less like competition and more like insurance. And once that possibility entered the conversation, everything changed. Owners noticed too. They began floating a narrative of their own that they weren't against paying players. They were against subsidizing fantasy economics, that they'd finally reached a point where profitability was possible, but only if growth wasn't strangled by unsustainable demands. And behind that argument lurked an unspoken threat. If the WNBA couldn't stand on its own, it didn't deserve infinite rescue. The league office tried to mediate, but its authority was slipping. Kathy Engelbert spoke about partnership, but neither side trusted the middle anymore. Each believed the other was negotiating in bad faith. And once trust dies, logic follows it out the door. Social media poured gasoline on everything. Players posted defiant messages about knowing their worth. Analysts warned of collapse. Fans accused owners of greed and players of arrogance in the same breath. Caitlin Clark's name trended again, not for a game-winning shot, but as a symbol of what could be lost. Angel Reese was dragged into the debate as proof of star power and controversy. Paige Buchers became the example of a future that might never arrive. Every star was turned into a bargaining chip by people who didn't have to live with the consequences. Then came the moment that confirmed escalation had gone too far. A respected insider reported that at least one ownership group had raised the possibility of formally dissolving its WNBA operation if the deal went through, not as a threat, but as a contingency plan. That single detail detonated panic, because folding a team isn't leverage. It's abandonment, and once abandonment becomes thinkable, the entire structure starts shaking. Players reacted with fury. Union leaders accused owners of sabotage. Owners accused the union of extortion. The language escalated into absolutes. Never impossible, non-starter. Each word closed another door. Inside locker rooms, the tension turned personal. Teammates argued about priorities, about sacrifice, about whether pride was worth losing seasons, careers, momentum. Some players quietly wondered if they were being used as shields for decisions they didn't fully understand. Others felt betrayed by the mere suggestion of compromise. And through it all, the clock kept ticking. January 9th stopped being a deadline and started feeling like a countdown, not to a deal but to a rupture. A lockout no one knew how to end. A pause that could stretch into irrelevance. A moment that future generations would point to and ask how it all went so wrong so fast. Because the second major twist wasn't just internal division, it was the realization that both sides were preparing for a world where the WNBA survives or dies without the other. Blinking first. And when escalation reaches that level, the next step isn't negotiation, it's fallout no one can contain. The public fallout hit like a wildfire, fed by gasoline and algorithms. Within hours, the WNBA wasn't trending for buzzer beaters or rivalries, it was trending for collapse. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds. Fans accused players of greed. Players accused owners of exploitation. Analysts screamed into microphones while scrolling leaked documents live on air, pretending shock while milking every second of panic. The league's image cracked in real time, and everyone could see the fracture spreading. Players felt it first, not in negotiations, in their mentions. Every star became a target. Caitlin Clark was framed as the savior being held hostage by a reckless union. Angel Reese was dragged into threads as proof of manufactured hype, inflating expectations. Paige Buchers was turned into a hypothetical casualty, a future star who might never get her moment if the league imploded. None of them asked to be symbols. All of them became one. Locker rooms tightened. Conversations stopped being about schemes and scouting and turned into whispers about seasons disappearing. Veterans worried about time they couldn't get back. Rookies panicked about careers that hadn't even started yet. Teammates side-eyed each other, wondering who was fully in and who was quietly scared. The union preached unity, but unity under pressure has a way of exposing fault lines. Owners felt the heat differently, colder, sharper. Sponsors started calling. Media partners wanted assurances they couldn't be given. Expansion groups suddenly paused their enthusiasm. The same momentum that once felt unstoppable now felt fragile, like glass already cracking under its own weight. Executives didn't just worry about losses. They worried about trust evaporating in public. The league office tried to steady the narrative, but it was already gone. Statements about ongoing talks sounded hollow against viral clips screaming doom. Kathy Engelbert's careful language was drowned out by louder voices predicting lockouts, cancellations, and permanent damage. The WNBA wasn't just negotiating a deal anymore. It was defending its right to exist in the public imagination. Fans fractured along ideological lines. Some rallied behind players, arguing decades of underpayment justified radical demands. Others turned vicious, accusing the union of killing the very league they claimed to love. Neutral fans, the most dangerous loss, began tuning out entirely, exhausted by the drama and unsure what they were even supporting anymore. Then the emotional weight turned inward. Players started questioning leadership. Quiet doubts surfaced about whether union heads had overplayed their hand. Group chats went silent at times, then exploded with arguments. Fear does that. It makes people brave and paranoid at the same time. Every new leak felt like betrayal. Every denial felt like spin. And hovering over all of it was the unspoken terror no one wanted to tweet. What if this actually ends the league? Not temporarily, not symbolically. What if this moment becomes the story future fans read about? The season when ambition outpaced reality and burned everything down. Media narratives sharpened into extremes. Either the WNBA was finally standing up for itself, or it was committing economic suicide. There was no space left for nuance. And without nuance, empathy vanished. Players were no longer people. Owners were no longer stewards. Everyone was an enemy now. Inside arenas, the tension became physical. Chants turned pointed. Jerseys were worn like political statements. Every game felt like a referendum on a future no one could see clearly anymore. The joy drained out, replaced by anxiety that clung to every possession. The most brutal part wasn't the anger, it was the uncertainty. Because when a league loses control of its narrative, it doesn't get to choose how it's remembered. And as the noise grew louder and the deadline crept closer, one reality settled in like a storm cloud that refused to move. This wasn't just bad press. This was the kind of emotional damage that doesn't disappear when a deal is signed, if a deal is signed at all. And with trust shattered in public and fear spreading in private, the final act was approaching fast. The only question left was whether the WNBA would survive it, or become a cautionary tale no one ever wanted to tell. The final twist didn't arrive with a signature or a handshake. It arrived with something far more terrifying: silence from the people who usually can't afford it. As the deadline crept closer, the leak slowed, the statements dried up. And that quiet wasn't peace. It was preparation. Because when both sides stop talking publicly, it usually means they're no longer trying to convince each other. They're bracing for impact behind the scenes. Contingency plans hardened into blueprints. Owners quietly explored what a paused league would actually look like, not emotionally, but financially. What contracts could be deferred? What obligations could be frozen? What teams could survive a year without games? The fact that those conversations were even happening told a brutal truth. The unthinkable had become thinkable. At the same time, union leadership doubled down internally, insisting that backing off now would erase decades of progress. They framed compromise as surrender. They framed patience as weakness. And for players who had already sacrificed so much, that message hit hard. No one wanted to be remembered as the generation that blinked. No one wanted to carry the shame of folding when power finally felt within reach. But that's where the twist cut deepest. Because while both sides were posturing publicly, Cracks were widening privately. Agents began warning select players that a prolonged shutdown could stall careers at the worst possible moment. Younger stars worried about momentum dying before it fully bloomed. Veterans feared their last real window might close without warning. And a few voices, quiet, influential, impossible to ignore, started asking a question that changed everything. What if winning this fight costs the league its future? That question didn't get tweeted. It didn't get leaked. But it spread. Slowly, uneasily. Because once you ask it, you can't unask it. And suddenly, the battle stopped being about revenue splits and started being about legacy. About whether this moment would be remembered as a stand for fairness or the point where ambition outran reality. Then came the detail that froze everyone. A high-level source suggested that if talks collapsed completely, the league might not come back in the same form at all. Not contraction, not temporary suspension. Reconfiguration. A softer word for something far more radical. Fewer guarantees, different structures, new partnerships, a future that wouldn't need the same agreements everyone was currently fighting over. That possibility sent shockwaves through both camps. Because if the league changes shape, power changes with it. Stars might lose leverage. Owners might lose control. The system everyone was trying to dominate could dissolve under their feet. And in that moment, the fight stopped feeling righteous and started feeling dangerous. Caitlin Clark's name surfaced again in private conversations, not as a savior, but as a variable. Angel Reese's visibility became a bargaining chip no one publicly acknowledged. Paige Bucher's future was whispered about like a promise that might never be cashed. The faces of the league weren't just watching anymore. They were being calculated, and the public still didn't know any of this. Fans argued in circles, unaware that the real decisions were being weighed in rooms they'd never see. Media screamed collapse while executives discussed survival. Players posted defiance while quietly wondering how long defiance could last without games to play. The most unsettling realization of all was this: no matter how this ends, something has already broken. Trust, illusion, the belief that growth alone could fix everything, that once shattered, it doesn't reassemble neatly. There was no final meeting announced, no emergency summit leaked, just a narrowing window and a league holding its breath. Because the final twist isn't about whether a deal gets done. It's about what kind of league comes out the other side, if one comes out at all. And as the clock ticks down and silence thickens, one question hangs over everything like a loaded wire waiting to snap. When the WNBA finally makes its next move, will it be a compromise that saves the league? Or a decision that ends it as we know it? Now it's on you, because this moment isn't just a negotiation story. It's a referendum on what kind of league the WNBA wants to be when the spotlight gets hot. Don't scroll past it. Don't reduce it to slogans. Decide where you stand. Are these demands a long overdue correction for years of sacrifice? Or are they a gamble so reckless it could erase everything this league has finally built? Say it out loud in the comments. Should the players' union hold the line no matter the cost? Or is this the moment to protect the future before pride turns into regret? And here's the question everyone's avoiding. If a lockout happens, and momentum dies, who actually pays the price? The owners with other assets, or the players whose careers run on a clock? If you want real, unfiltered breakdowns of WNBA power struggles, labor wars, and the politics behind the headlines, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications right now. Because the next update won't be a rumor, it'll be a decision that reshapes women's basketball for a generation.